The German tribes, collectively, were some of Rome's most infamous and long-standing enemies throughout its imperial history. Under Arminius, a confederation of German peoples banded together to inflict one of Rome's greatest defeats.
Quintilius Varus, where are my eagles?
But what did the Romans think of the people over the Alps? Well, to begin with, the ancient Romans saw the Germans as barbarians by virtue of their foreignness alone. But even in the early days of imperial expansion, opinions regarding the Germans that survived treat them as particularly primitive compared to their Gallic neighbours. Even today, looking back millennia, it's easy to imagine a blonde, shabby German warrior as the epitome of ancient barbarism. Unfortunately, there really isn't much that survives in the way of descriptions or sources written about the Germans from the Roman perspective. In fact, only two major works that have anything to do with them have been passed down to us. Tacitus's Germania, which is not even exceptionally long, and the big guy himself, Gaius Julius Caesar, who squeezes in just a couple of pages describing their disgustingly brutal lives before casually describing, in third person, how he built a cool bridge over the Rhine and killed thousands of Swabians. The problem is that the Romans didn't deal with the Germans in the same way they dealt with the people like the Greeks or the Gauls. Famously, they were unable to hold on to much of Germany beyond the Rhine, and even when they did get a stronghold, it was usually lost within a generation or two. The usual process of civilizing and Latinizing the region never took place, and imperial accounts of German customs could therefore only come through war and trade and diplomacy and slavery. But between them, Tacitus and Caesar managed to cram in an awful lot about these very interesting people, and how they felt about them really shines through with a vague understanding of Roman taboos and their views on virtue. You see, neither writer was recording the lives of Germans with the intention of casting their opinion on them, but for wholly different reasons. Caesar writes down a couple interesting details in a much broader account of his conquest of Gaul, while Tacitus, writing decades later, was carrying on a long tradition of describing foreign tribes and nations to the people back home. For starters, the pair are pretty clear that the Germans are barbaric compared to Rome. Something that's clear from both of them is that they are too unsophisticated to have proper agriculture. Tacitus says it goes as far as barley for their beer, while Caesar claims that wheat is completely non-existent among the Germans. And this is also what he blames on why he can't advance deep into Germany. You have to bear in mind he was writing a piece of propaganda after all. Instead, the Germans rely on cattle and sheep and pigs for all their sustenance. Tacitus drives home this idea that they are simply incapable of any kind of cuisine like the Romans, while Caesar backs him up and says they basically live off cheese and beef. Doesn't sound too bad to me, but both of these guys are obviously treating the idea with complete contempt. But apparently, the Germans can't even look after their animals. Despite the land being good for grazing, both Tacitus and Caesar make a point about how small and malnourished the cattle look. Caesar thinks this is odd compared to the incredibly large wild animals in the region, and so indirectly blames the Germans as being terrible herders. Tacitus rationalizes it by explaining that the Germans are far more interested in the quantity of livestock rather than their size, because this is the closest that the Germans have to wealth. They don't have coins. He even makes a funny little joke that he doesn't know whether their lack of money, silver and gold is a sign of divine favor or divine wrath. Nonetheless, though, the lack of coinage is definitely an insult on Tacitus's part, even if he gives a nod to them. Caesar, on the other hand, does not have many positive things to say about the Germans. One of his only compliments is about their appearance, and he states plainly that their lifestyle of hunting and fishing has made them all big and tough, and this was what they were famous for. Tacitus is even more becoming in his praise, and he describes German men as having, quote, fierce-looking blue eyes, reddish hair, and big frames, which, however, can exert their strength only by means of violent effort. According to both Romans, a life of hunting and herding and fighting aren't the only reasons, though, why the Germans are so big and tough. Both Tacitus and Caesar are quick to point out this weird quirk that the Germans seem to have, which all revolves around chastity, this idea that you don't get laid as a German man. And I can't tell what their opinion on this is, but they might just be as weirded out as myself. Here's what Caesar has to say. Quote, those who remain chaste the longest win the highest praise among their own people. Some believe it makes them taller, Others, it gives them strength and determination. They consider it a matter of shame to have sex with a woman before reaching 20, nor does the matter allow for concealment, for both sexes mingle together when they wash themselves in rivers. And also, they wear hides and skins which offer little protection, leaving most of their body naked. Weird. But, at the same time, neither of these guys are saying that it's an exceptionally weird thing to do, and this probably comes down to them admiring the Germans as individuals, even if they don't respect them as a fighting force. And when it comes to warfare, the primitive nature of German tactics, and in particular German cavalry and weapons, are mocked. But the courage of individual warriors and the shame of weakness are treated as high virtues. Tacitus is eager to speak of the virtues of German women as well, and their presence on the battlefield. And they were around to tend to wounds and to cheer their husbands and fathers on. Not only does Tacitus think it's great on the women's part, but the idea of them wailing to remind their husbands of the imminent consequences of defeat, brilliant. He tells us that the German men are outright willing to sacrifice their own lives in order to protect their loved ones from the shameful condition of slavery. And a repeated theme in Tacitus's work is the admiration he has for the Germans' idea of freedom, which in itself is very reminiscent of Aristotle and his views on the Scythians. There is one exception with this, though, and it's when he wholeheartedly approves of the very, very strict marriage code the Germans have. Tacitus goes as far as saying, no feature of their morality deserves higher praise. And this is because, unlike other greedier barbarians, the Germans only take one wife, and the dowry is given to the brides by the husbands and not the reverse. And as well, he likes to focus on this dowry isn't something silly like jewelry or linen, but oxen and weapons and other practical stuff, which is a big plus to Tacitus. In turn, the wife hands her groom symbolic weapons so that he might protect her and their family. The following is the best part of his Germania, because it not only perfectly describes how Tacitus feels about the Germans, but also what he feels about Rome in his own time. I'm just going to let him speak for himself. Quote, by such means is the virtue of women protected. They live uncorrupted by the temptations of public shows or the excitement of banquets and parties. Clandestine love letters are unknown to men and women alike. Adultery is extremely rare, considering the size of the population. A guilty wife is summarily punished by her husband. He cuts off her hair, strips her naked, and in the presence of kinsmen, turns her out of the house and flogs her all through the village. They have, in fact, no mercy on a wife who prostitutes her chastity. Neither beauty, youth, nor wealth can find her another husband. No one in Germany finds vice amusing, or calls it up to date to seduce or be seduced. Even better is the practice of those states in which only virgins may marry, so that a woman who has once been a bride has finished with all such hopes and aspirations. She takes a husband just as she takes a body and one life. Her thoughts must not stray beyond him, or her desires survive him. And even that husband she must not love for himself, but as an embodiment of the married state. To restrict the number of children or to kill any of those born after the heir is considered wicked. Good morality is more effective in Germany than good laws are elsewhere. Quote, in every home, children go naked and dirty and develop their strength of limb and tall stature that excite our imagination. Every mother feeds her child at the breast and does not deputize the task to maids or wet nurses. The young master is not distinguished from the slave by pampering in his upbringing. They live together among the same flocks of animals and the same earthen floor until maturity sets apart the free and the spirit of valor claims them as her own. Caesar, on the other hand, never musters this kind of endorsement of primitive German life. In fact, he really doesn't offer them anything but contempt. In particular, Caesar scorns the Swabians for their lack of religious structure or understanding. You see, the Romans had this peculiar thing called interpretatio Gracchi, or interpretatio Romana, which occurred when they came into contact with foreign nations. It meant they would interpret this foreign tribe's gods through their own pantheon. So, for instance, when Caesar, who was the highest priest in Rome, mind you, deals with the Gauls and their druids, He's quite impressed with their relatively civilized form of religious order, and he interprets the Celtic god Lugus as the Roman Mercury, and just flatly states that the Gauls worship Mercury as their head god. It's not only a way for Caesar and other Romans to interpret the outside world, but also a sure sign of respect towards the Gallic people. In other words, Caesar is saying, well, you guys might be a bunch of savages, but at least we worship the same deities. Caesar, on the other hand, does not offer this olive branch of respect to the Germans, and states that they are just too barbarous to even heard of Roman gods. Instead, they primitively worship what's around them, such as the moon, the sun, the sea, and trees. Quite the chastising from the Pontifex Maximus here. But Tacitus isn't so mean-spirited, and instead goes into great detail about what the Germans believed in. For a start, he mentions how they viewed women as partly sacred, in a way, often with a gift for fortune-telling and prophecy. He even says that some Germans have come to revere historical women as goddesses, such as the seer Velida. Going on, Tacitus sees the gods Woden, Tyr, and Thor as Mercury, Mars, and Hercules, respectively. And overall, Tacitus is far more positive and open about German religion than Caesar is, and even bizarrely seems to gloss over their quite often habit of human sacrifice, which would otherwise have disgusted his readers as the most heinous taboo in Roman worship. Finally, Caesar is eager to attack the Germans one last time on how they fight and win their spoils. Though he readily admits that the Germans are really tough characters, he is openly appalled by their custom of allowing young men to go out and rove in foreign lands to rob and plunder stuff, and without having any kind of legal consequences when they get back home. This, again, was a major Roman taboo, and something that Caesar himself was accused of doing in Gaul by his arch-rival Cato, and this is probably perhaps why he focuses to choose on it. But in general, we have a good understanding of what the Romans themselves considered to be German life, and it's fairly vicious and crude. And though Tacitus is far more forgiving of their barbarous ways than Caesar, his flattery really only goes as far as their treatment of women. And even in that regard, he is obviously trying to drive a point about the state of imperial Roman women as equally promiscuous and adulterous, rather than compliment the Germans. In a way, he's saying to them back home, look, even the savages can control themselves.
Is there anyone in Novo who has not slept with my daughter?